Sinai was not a foreign land to the Egyptians. It was actually part of Egypt. It came under pharaonic control. So Moses and the Israelites, when they left Egypt and crossed into Sinai, were theoretically, for that moment in time, still in Egypt. Sinai came under the control of some particular public officials. One was called the royal chancellor, other was called the royal messenger, and these people governed Sinai. Moses' era was the era of Egypt's 18th dynasty, and in fact we know exactly who the governors of Sinai were in the 18th dynasty. We know their names, we know their families. The royal messenger was a guy called Nebi, and he was also mayor and troop commander in the set town of Zaru, which in fact was the chief town in Goshen where the Israelites had come from. It's where they spent their years in Egypt. The royal chancellor was held in the family of Par-Nihas. Panahesi of this family was the official governor of Sinai at the time. The family of Par-Nihas goes right back into the kingship of ancient Troy. It's a family that moves through kingship all the way through history, and at that time Par-Nihas was governing Canaan. The Bible calls him Phineas. So when we read about Phineas becoming one of the first priests of the Egyptian church, of the Israelite church, this is Par-Nihas. This is the governor of Sinai, a very important man. Another thing to understand before we follow Petri into the discovery is that there was an immense difference at the time, although the Bible doesn't make it clear, between a group of people called Hebrews and a group of people called Israelites. They weren't the same thing at all. The Hebrews were the family descendants of Abraham. They were descendants of his line, and in essence, they lived in the land of Canaan and in Palestine. The Israelites were no more nor less than the descendants of one of Abraham's grandsons. This was the grandson called Jacob, who changed his name to Israel, who took the family to Egypt, where they spent many centuries before coming out with Moses. And this family were called Israelites, children of Israel, the founder of the family. So what we have to recognize about the story of the mountain of Moses is that when Moses came out of Egypt, he came out of Egypt with Israelites, not with Hebrews. The whole point of the story of the laws and the ordinances given at Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai, was really a part of bringing the Israelites back into the Hebrew community, a foreign land, where they actually had to learn new rules, new regulations, new laws, to be part of the family that they themselves originally grew from. So that's kind of where it sits. Israelites were not Hebrews. In time to come, the word Jews comes up in history, Judeans. They weren't necessarily Hebrews or Israelites, they were simply people who lived in Judea. Today, all of these words get roped into one, and they're sort of one people. So the Israelites had spent something like 400 odd years living in a part of Egypt, up there in the Nile Delta, in the land of Goshen, the city of which was Zaru. Through 400 years, having no contact personally, hardly at all, with their Hebrew relatives in Canaan, they grew up in a completely different environment. They grew up in an environment that didn't have this single Jehovah God as their God. They grew up in a country with a pantheon of gods. It was the Egyptian law that they followed. However, being of the family that they were, they still hit upon the idea of following a kind of Hebrew concept. And they had a one God concept among themselves in Goshen. They simply called this God Lord, Adonai, my Lord. And this is one of the reasons why the names Lord and Jehovah crop up independently in the Bible. But we read them as if they're talking about the same person. For the most part, they're not. One God was the Lord, the other God was Jehovah. Jehovah was strictly for the Hebrews. To the Egyptians, the name Adon was pronounced Aten, A-T-E-N, and it's from that we get the name of Pharaoh Akhenaten, servant of Aten. This was a one-God concept which Akhenaten brought into Egypt just before the time of Moses. So even Egypt had within that Goshen area this one God ideal. Across the water, the Hebrews had the one God ideal, but it was a different God. So when Moses came into Sinai with the Israelites, they didn't arrive as worshippers of Jehovah when they got to this magic mountain. They were worshippers of Aten. And it was for this very reason, as I mentioned, that they were given a whole new set of laws and ordinances to comply with the Hebrew culture of their prospective new homeland. So back to Flinders Petrie. He goes to the mountain, and he knows that there's going to be something there. Quite how he knows, he doesn't explain, but he knows that this is the mountain, and he knows that if he looks hard enough, he's going to find a secret there. Well, to start with, they found nothing very much at all. But on a wide plateau, very near the summit of this mountain, they found things that made them believe there had been habitation there. There were things around that looked like buildings sticking out of this plateau, 2,600 feet up a mountain. There were great pillars, standing stones protruding out of a whole heap of rubble. So he decided to have a look and see what was underneath this rubble. This rubble had been deposited by winds and landslides over 3,000 years. But when it was finally moved away, Petrie wrote at that time, "There is no other monument known which makes us regret more that it is not in better preservation. The whole of this was buried. No one had any knowledge of it until we cleared the site." What they found high up on Mount Horeb, 2,000 feet above sea level, was an enormous Egyptian temple. 230 feet of it spread out above ground, another part of it spread out within a cave below ground, cut into the mountainside with shored edges and polished sides. And the various inscriptions and cartouches around this temple and on the walls and the standing stones led him to discover that this had been an operative Egyptian temple right back to the time of the very first dynasty of Egypt. We're looking at Moses in the 18th dynasty of Egypt, so that's going back a long, long way. And this temple had been operative all through that time, 3000 BC. The above ground part of the temple was mostly sandstone, quarried from the mountain itself. It comprised a series of halls and corridors, shrines, cubicles, chambers, and of these, the features that are now open for inspection are the main sanctuary, the Shrine of Kings, the portico court. These are big. The hall of the goddess Hathor. The whole of this temple complex that Moses took the Israelites to, where they apparently met with Jehovah to receive the Ten Commandments and the new ordinances, was a temple of the goddess Hathor. She appears on reliefs all around the place. The cave cut into the rock is dedicated to Hathor. The walls that are smoothed and polished like marble have her pictures all over them. And yet this is supposed to be the magic mountain of Jehovah. Deep within the cave, Petrie found a limestone standing stone of the pharaoh Ramesses I. Now, all of the experts today tell us that Ramesses was a hater of the Aten cult in Egypt. Not what Ramesses himself said. He describes himself with the title, "I am Ramesses, I am the ruler of all that Aten embraces." So the experts are telling us untruths even today about what these pharaohs were about. Also found was a statue head of the mother of Moses within this temple. So it proved that not only had it been in constant use right back from about 3000 BC, even by the time that Moses got there in about 1330 BC, it was already being used in that recent period. It was constantly in use, this great temple. In the halls and the courts of the outer temple, there are stone tanks, rectangular basins and baths and all sorts of curiously shaped tables and benches that nobody could make any sense out of. They didn't look like altars. They had recessed fronts, they had split level surfaces, and the whole thing reminded them more of a laboratory than it did of a temple. There were alabaster vases, there were containers, and all these are shaped like lotus flowers and things like that. There are all sorts of articles there. There were wands there. They called them wands. They were like little priest sticks. And even today, they can't quite work out what they're made of. The material is very, very hard. These things are all designed, but they're not designed in the normal Egyptian style. They have basket work, they have lattice work, they have a style of design that is more Mesopotamian than Egyptian, and yet this is an Egyptian temple. They also found a few other very strange things. When they move into the Hathor temple complex, which appears to be the central point at where all of this energy comes from, they begin to find some strange things. Conical stones set very carefully on a shelf, little cones of stone. A metallurgist's crucible was very apparent. Now these kind of things began to get Patri and his people wondering, well, what on earth had these things got to do with a temple? There was nothing in temple law that said that metallurgist crucibles were part of what went on. And all over the temple, all over the walls and on the various stones, was something venerated, highly venerated within the temple complex, and it was called mufkuts. Doesn't mean a lot to us today, mufkuts. Okay, mufkuts. They found 2,600 feet above sea level in the mountain of the Bible, conical stones, metallurgist crucibles, tanks, basins, lotus flower equipment, all sorts of wands and tubing that look like a laboratory, and references venerating some mysterious substance called mufkuts. Now, they knew that these things were all linked together, but they didn't know how. So they began to try and work out what on earth mufkuts was. Some said it was probably copper. Many preferred the idea of turquoise. Others have supposed it was perhaps malachite. But the funny thing about these guesses was that none of these materials was apparent within the temple complex. There was no malachite, there was no turquoise, there was no copper. Sinai is noted for its turquoise mines, but if mining had been a primary function of that temple over 2,000 to 3,000 years, you'd expect to find turquoise stones in the tombs of Egypt. There are barely any at all. So if they were working for 3,000 years mining turquoise, they clearly only found about half a dozen. Copper, they said. Well, it didn't take them long to realize that if you were mining and smelting copper, you need very different equipment to this sort of equipment. This was not metal rectification equipment in the way that they knew it. Copper was apparent in Sinai, but down in the deep valleys there were smelting works, old smelting works, and they were nothing like this temple at all. There was no residue of copper anywhere except references to mufkuts. Another cause of wonderment as they traveled around this, as they kept removing all of this rubble, was that they kept seeing inscribed references to bread. Everywhere there were references to bread, and bread was always written alongside mufkuts. The other thing that happened all the time was that the most prominent of all the hieroglyphic signs outside that was the sign for light. Now, bread and light and mufkuts all seem to be equally important within this temple complex. This was nothing to do with copper. It had something to do with these strange tanks, these strange laboratory tables with their recessed fronts and split level surfaces. So, bread, mufkuts, light, conical stones, metallurgist crucibles, all of these posed a problem until they decided to clear the rubble from a series of square storerooms in one of the parts of the temple. As they removed the rubble, they came across slabs of stone beneath the rubble. They moved the slabs of stone, and beneath these, carefully stored in every one of about 4 or 5 of these large square rooms, a few inches deep, packed tight on the floor, were tons and tons of the finest, purest, unadulterated white powder. So, said the experts, this is clearly the result of copper smelting. So they did some copper smelting and discovered that what you actually get from copper smelting is a dense, black, filthy slag. You do not get white powder. There was no copper actually within miles of the mountain, even though copper exists in Sinai in abundance in some parts. Others said this clearly was from the burning